Good afternoon, friends. It's a real pleasure to have Aanchal Malhotra with us in this edition of Afternoons with an Author. Aanchal, as we are all aware, is a person who's done a lot on partition history. She's done books on non-fiction, she's done books on fiction. Of course, it's very difficult to make that very clear distinction between fiction and non-fiction. But last year, the Hindi translation of a book, Yadon ke Bikhre Moti, was given the WOW Award for the best translation from Bhashas of Bharat to Hindi. So congratulations, Aanchal. And we are very sure that next year your book will make a lot of waves. But let's begin by, first of all, complimenting you on this absolutely wonderful narrative. I've always been thinking, that while it's very easy to have tangible objects as memory, and you've also dealt with a lot of tangible objects as memory, as remembrance. How did you think of having something as intangible as memory, as intangible as a perfume made at a point of time, and you constructed such a lovely story around this? So maybe you can begin by telling us about that, Aanchal.
Firstly, thank you so much for having me, and it's a real honor given the award from last year as well. Um, I think that most of us will agree that sometimes a smell, however inconspicuous or sudden, when it enters your periphery and reminds you of someone or something in the past, it can be a very potent portal into that time. And I don't think I had read anything that um, from at least from the Indian landscape of literature that connected our senses of smell to memory in a more definitive way. Whereas, it happens almost all the time. You open a trunk and it
Yes.
smells of a certain time. You smell an odd perfume that belonged to your grandmother and you remember her and how she used to wear it. So I think smell has the ability to unlock so many memories, good or bad. And of course, it is the most mysterious of our senses and most un- like under understood, I would say.
Absolutely.
So I
Absolutely.
think it was also a way to explore something that is so powerful yet so invisible, as a channel to tell a story.
Great. So, friends, this is a story about perfumes. It's a story about olfactory senses. It's a story about the World War. It's a story about, Vivek. Vivek is an army deserter. There are very few stories in which an army deserter becomes a muse. It's again a very fascinating story that you woven together, the relationship between Vivek and Samir. So, in fact, I think it might be nice if you share a bit of storyline with our listeners, so that then our conversation will become more engaged.
Okay, without giving too many spoilers, I will say that the story begins in a pre-partition Lahore. It goes back to the time of the First World War, when Indian soldiers were being sent for the first time to fight alongside their European counterparts in places like Flanders and France. And the story begins with this man, Vivek, who thinks that he's going across the world as a part of the army for adventure, and he wants to see the world. And when he arrives on the battlefield, he realizes that actually war isn't what he thought it was going to be. There's no great adventure. It's actually sort of a recipe for cowardice when it comes to him. And so he almost wills his mind to forget the landscape of war he's in and to remember the landscape of home through smells and images and drawings and writings that he does. And as you said, he deserts the war. He becomes a perfumer. He returns home to Lahore many years after the war. And the story is really about his nephew who inherits this incredible nose, Samir, and the relationship between these two perfumers and how their lives are paralleled to each other through tragedy and triumph, through happiness and sadness and love and heartbreak, and of course partitions and wars.
Yes, in fact, sometimes I felt that, Firdaus, although it ends with with the perfume that he's made for Firdaus. Sometimes I feel that Firdaus ki kahani, I mean, it didn't get that much space, in this narrative of the Vij family. It could also be that you know much more about the Vij family in the sense that you would have a personal connect with the Vij family. How did you build this character of Firdaus? Because that would be perhaps more difficult than building a character about a Punjabi Khatri, because that's terrain with which we are more familiar. So,
Hmm.
how did you get into the character of Firdaus, into calligraphy, the world of a Rabba, the world of a Amma? And that's a fantastic story by itself. So,
Yes.
tell us more about that, and then we'll carry on our conversation, amongst these characters.
It's interesting you say that because when I started writing the book, it was really about Samir, and Firdaus was going to be seen through his life, through his gaze. She wasn't really a major character. And then as I began writing, she demanded a lot more page space. And this is something that happens in fiction that almost never happens in nonfiction, that your character begins to ask for more agency, begins to do things that you didn't intend for them to do. And I think this was one of the joys of writing fiction as well. But yes, we do see Firdaus, and I wish sometimes that I could have included more of her story, because in some ways I would say the things that Firdaus likes to do and the kind of person she is and the craft that she follows and her family still practices, which is calligraphy. And paper making and anything that comes with that kind of texture and caress of material really comes from the years when I was a printer. So before
Okay.
I was a writer, I spent many years being a metal engraver and a printmaker. And I made paper and I did calligraphy and I set type. And so her story and her interest really come from my original interest in life, which is artistry. And so I think it was interesting also to juxtapose calligraphy with perfumery, which are both crafts that are really dying in today's world, of
Yes,
course.
they are. At least
But
they
then,
don't have that salience which they had in our
absolutely.
grandparents' times.
Absolutely. And so the sanctity with which both Samir refers to perfumery and Firdaus refers to calligraphy, I think, is something that I felt for my craft of printing, which was also quite an obsolete craft when I was working on it. And then, of course, like you said, her parents, her Ammi and her Abba, they are composites of people that I'd spoken to for my nonfiction work. In some cases, I think that her father was too progressive for the time. In other cases, I feel like her mother was probably the truest character of the book. I am also, their story intrigues me a lot as well.
Yes, and of course you've captured Lahore. In fact, a lot of people have captured Lahore in their books, and so we do get a very nice reflection of Lahore. But I'd like to share with the readers, the description, how she describes the ocean, because describing the ocean for someone in Lahore would be a real challenge. So when Vivek and Samir, they are talking, and Samir wants to ask his Tayaji. He says, "So tell me about the ocean." So he says, it is, if you put 50 of these ravis together, you put 50 of these large rivers together, then there is course upon course of salty water, and you map those waters. So it is these descriptions, which also show how people on land look at the sea, and people on land look at the sea. And this Vivek, because he's a literate sepoy, a rarity in that time when most of the sepoys were supposed to be full of brawn but not have brain. So conceptualizing this person Vivek, who is not really of the martial race as the Britishers would put it, and then he writes letters, examines a lot of things. So how did this person come in your imagination?
There are some, if you go back to the archives, there are some, maybe honestly just two or three journals that remain of soldiers who were literate. And they
Hmm.
were soldiers who did not, like Vivek becomes a katib, a letter writer almost, right? He goes to France, but these soldiers just wrote in their journals. So I think it was finding documents like that are not publicly available, or actually just the fact that we don't really think of India when we think of the World War. It was to let people know how big a part of those wars we really were, and how much ours it became as well, and how we played such a big role on the world stage. Because when we learn about the First and Second World War in school, I guess most people learn about it in school, India doesn't really factor into our understanding of what the war was, whereas we sent 1.5 million soldiers nearly, and on top of that, material and animals and all that stuff. So, firstly, it was to create awareness about the breadth of our contribution to the war. Second, the character of Vivek is kind of an anomaly, and he is someone that I don't think he really understands what war is, because like I said, he just wants to go on this grand adventure, and he gets there, and he then, because he comes from a family that is educated, turns to his sensory and literary pursuits to be able to keep himself sane. And of course, my I suppose, greatest source in creating the character of Vivek was the letters that the soldiers themselves had written home during the war. Indian soldiers were writing something like 15,000 letters per week. And
Yes.
if you think about it, they were non literate, but they were quite literary. They were quite poetic in the manner that they narrated their letters. They would narrate them to a katib. He would write them in the various languages, Hindi, Urdu, Garhwali, sometimes Marathi, Gujarati. And then they had to pass through the British censor mail. And this is why this source is quite a complicated source for us, because it goes through so many degrees of actual separation from what the soldiers said to what was written, to what was translated, to what was redacted, and what finally remains. Because we can only envision the original word they would have written, or the original thought they may have had, because we have English translations. However, even those English translations give us such a color of how their life was, about battle, of course, but then about the life around the battle, the things that they thought, how they wrote things like, I don't know how long this war is going to go on for, 3 days or 3 years. This war is like Mahabharat, this war is like Karbala. They're talking about snow, and they said, oh, we've never seen this snow before, and they're rejoicing. And then the very next day they say, it's so bitter and cold that the ink in my ink pot has frozen. I remember Vivek writes this in a letter. He says, the ink in my ink pot is frozen, and I need to warm it over a fire to write this letter to you. And of course,
And
they write about the society, they write about the women that they meet. They see women working, they see educated women, they see the role of children, they see the role of animals on farms, and they write all this back to their families in India.
one more thing, Anchal, which I noticed was that when they are writing, there is at that point of time a great deal of camaraderie between the Hindus and the Sikhs and the Muslims. I mean, one cannot imagine after seeing the letters which Vivek had written in First World War that within 2 or 3 decades, these soldiers and these ex-soldiers would be at each other's throat. So, those passages where you write that, in fact, if you could read out that letter when he says that one son has died, but I'm still there for you. It's a fantastic story, and it also shows how the seeds of separation between India and Pakistan, they weren't there till the 19. I mean, till the First World War. Punjab was not, Punjab had not been strewn apart. But then something happened in the 20s, 30s, the Muslim League and Jinnah's Lahore resolution, after which Punjab was no longer the Punjab that had been. So the identity of Punjab gets totally divided. So maybe
Mhm.
you share your thoughts on this aspect.
Well, I mean, I think it's complicated also in my nonfiction work when I was speaking to soldiers that had served with men that became Indian or Pakistani and after partition had to fight against them in several wars. I think the psychological aspects of it, the obviously, I mean, I don't know how much the ethical aspect, but the aspect of shared memory and a shared camaraderie during the two world wars certainly entered their mind as well, and it was very complicated. But yes, this is certainly something Samir and Firdaus as well, have to deal with in their life through Vivek's memories. Samir, especially when he's thinking about partition and he's thinking about everything that he has seen, and he's reading the letters that his uncle wrote home, he cannot imagine at Vivek's time something like partition happening. And he cannot imagine after partition something like Vivek's time still holding true. You know, I'm trying to find the letters that you.
That's fine. I mean, as we leaf through, maybe we can come
Yes.
back to that later. The other thought which was coming to me, was this intergenerational connect that you've been able to build. It's actually you've been able to build the story of Vivek, you've been able to build the story of Samir, and now you've taken it to their grandchildren. So I think it's got something to do with your personal relationship with your grandparents. And it's a fascinating story of how trying to search for your grandmother's, I mean, your grandmother's first love. You set it up in Pakistan with a young journalist. It's a very bold way of looking at things. It's a very interesting concept. So I'd like to first compliment you on that. And then also, also ask you more about this young Samir who's trying to now meet the grandfatherly Samir, and perhaps there'll be a sequel in which something because you leave it very open. It's like the ending is very Bollywood, I would say, in the sense that it opens a lot of possibilities for a sequel.
Well, actually, the ending was left quite open-ended because I didn't want people to say कि तुमने वीर ज़ारा लिख दी है ऐसा कुछ. Um, लेकिन I
There is a
guess.
possibility. There is a possibility. I mean,
Yes,
the
I
setting
mean,
is such that
really?
uh,
Do you think so?
Well, after reading the book, one felt that a sequel I mean, a sequel is on the annual, and that over a
Hmm.
period of time this will happen because for them also. In fact, I think now we'll have to share with the readers. Let me first of all request the reader that please buy the book. It's value for money. Please buy it. But having said that, you'll get this book. We can give you a little sneak preview on the storyline. So why don't you do it, Anchal? That'll be better because you're the writer.
Well, of course, we all know that partition happens, and Samir and Firdaus, who were together before partition, are no longer together because Samir is a Hindu and he migrates to India, and Firdaus remains in Pakistan. And the novel goes on for a few decades, and as you mentioned, it actually culminates in their grandchildren. And the reason for this is that I have spent a very large time with grandchildren and subsequent generations of survivors of partition trying to piece together their grandparents' lives. I think it goes without saying that the generation that has done a lot of work for partition is the subsequent generation who is trying to make sense of what happened, who is trying to unmake the other, sometimes understand why the other is the other. And not to mention, I am a third generation. I am a grandchild. I've spent a lot of time asking questions to which I know there are no answers sometimes. I ask questions sometimes just to ask the question. And this is what Samir's granddaughter Anouk, who is born in Paris, and Firdaus's grandson, who she names Samir, who is born in Lahore, try to do as well. They try to make sense of a time that they have not seen and try to search for the people who are most important to their grandparents. Now, this may be a bold move, but actually, it's not that unusual because in the stories that I collected for my nonfiction work, several younger people were trying to do exactly that. Many of them had found letters that belonged to either friends or girlfriends or boyfriends before partition, and many of them were actually trying to look for those people to understand what their grandparents' life was like before partition, before it changed forever. So I didn't think that it was such a radical thing to have done. Of course, without the context of the nonfiction work, it seems really an unusual thing, and it seems a relationship of great openness between a grandparent and a grandchild, which luckily both Anouk in Paris and Samir Jr. in Lahore did have. But I think that specifically Samir, he is a person that wants to find not just his grandmother's first love, but also the large Hindu and Sikh community that used to be in Lahore before partition, that were an economic majority. So in the book, you see him walking through the areas that they would have inhabited, asking people, "Ki yahan pe, do you remember people who lived here? Do you remember the shopkeepers who lived here?" Because he's trying to, I suppose, create a portal into that kind of past that he can't even imagine.
So
He
tell
says
me,
that. Hmm,
Anchal, we've seen it. We've seen it that the partition. I mean, the people who survived partition just wanted to erase it. I mean, there was in some ways an erasure of memory, and I think the next generation is far more comfortable, both materially and emotionally. So perhaps I think the generation which comes immediately after such an event, that is perhaps in a better position to cope with memory than the ones who have suffered it or faced it so intimately. So you and I are perhaps more comfortable talking about partition than maybe our grandparents, who actually saw it, and for whom it was blood, it was violence, it is actually somebody, their mother or their father or their brother or their sister, actually getting assaulted, their building actually getting razed to the ground. We've only heard stories about that, but I think memory also has, it's there somewhere, and yet it doesn't become so. Perhaps the generation after the one which has faced this onslaught is more willing to talk about it, and more willing to even to open up the hand of friendship, whereas those who would have actually been in it may have the bitterness would perhaps have been very, very intense.
it's
I
complicated
just
because humans
uh,
humans are complicated.
yes.
The generation that lived through partition, even if they may have wanted to speak about what happened, I don't think they had the vocabulary or the luxury to consider what they were going through. They simply had to get on with their life because survival was the necessity. And over time, this survival kind of swallowed anything else, especially the need to discuss what had happened. And this, they are often known as the silent generation, or like when I spoke to my grandparents, the first questions they asked me were, "Well, why do you want to know?" And maybe partition is one of those unique events where you ask a question and a question is asked back to you. Well, why do you want to know? What will it change? The past will still be the past. And I think with survivors, you need someone to ask them that question. Maybe after many, many decades have passed, maybe at any other point in their life, but the question needs to be asked for them to open up. I don't think my grandparents would have ever spoken about what had happened unless I'd asked about it.
And
Now,
ask persistently, and ask
persistence,
persistently. That is the
absolutely.
point with that. And
Right.
partition. I just also wanted to make a general statement, and see whether you would agree. That while there are individual memories which all of us would have, there are also collective memories, and partition is a collective memory. Partition is both a tangible collective memory and an intangible collective memory,
Yes.
and the tangible and the intangible memory of Punjab is also different from that of Bengal, because in Punjab everything happened in a period of 4 to 5 months. From the month of July till the month of August, till the month of September, October, everything was finished and done. I mean, such large scale movement of people, such large scale violence. I mean, the change of character of Lahore and East Punjab and Delhi being a testimony to that point. Now tell me, uh, you have worked both on fiction and on non-fiction, and you also said that it's non-fiction gives you much greater liberty, to develop a character like Firdaus, because without the flexibility of of a fiction novel, you may not have been able to create somebody like Firdaus. So, would I be right in saying that there can be no fiction without non-fiction, and vice versa?
Well, I would say sometimes fiction is stranger than more true sometimes than reality. And when you are working on reality, things just seem so bizarre, particularly when it comes to Partition, because the stories that you hear from real people sometimes sound like fictitious narratives, what they have lived, what they have seen. Similarly, when you're working on fiction, I thought that my fiction was really rooted in reality,
It
because all
is.
of these things were very like, and this was really my the place where I had most trouble, is because as a historian, when you're writing a novel, how much is too much information? And every page, I wanted every page to be real. Every, I suppose, news bulletin was real. Every radio broadcast was real. Every path that someone is taking from point A to point B is an actual road. And for me, I don't think there could have been any fiction without my background of nonfiction. I needed to have been immersed in that landscape for many years to be able to think of it in terms that were fictional. But I
Absolutely.
I don't know how it is for other people.
No, you see,
Um,
whether most books on partition history, most novels on partition history, whether it is Fikr Tosfi or whether it is Manpreet Sodhi Someshwar's latest volume on Lahore, or whether it is Nanak Singh's book or whatever. All these books, because the reality of partition, the reality of 40s, 50s was such that all the literature that has been inspired, so whether it is Amrita Pritam, anyone. So I'm sure you read a lot of this partition literature. Naturally, many of us in Punjab have read this through. But I'll come back to that later. Let me, friends, read to you something about perfumes and perfumery, and I'd like to quote my some of my favorite lines from Anchal, because she's written many lines, and so I have many favorite lines. So, but this is something about which most readers will not be aware of, because most readers would be aware of the fire and that place, so Jinnah's speech and Nehru's speech. But let's talk about perfumes. And she says, uh, all perfumes are in some way inspired by people. They become a homage, they become a dedication, they're a tribute. In fact, a perfume without memory is like a body without a soul. One, this part is fine, but now the next part is more complicated. The next part says one cannot create a perfume for a place. Now, this means that you can't create a perfume for Oroville or for Taj Mahal or for the Red Fort or for anything. That dialogue, she says, is unsustainable. A perfume is always created for people in general or a person in particular, and our memories, our histories, our desires, our fears, our interactions are like any other ingredient, a prized flower, a rare spice, a fine herb, and we must use them just the same. Now, this is a doctoral work. There's a doctoral work on perfumes. So I want you to break up each of these parts and tell us about this. The first
so
being that all perfumes are inspired by people and not places. So, if you said that are inspired by people and places, that would be one thing. But you are very particular in saying that it's only people who can inspire a perfume.
yeah, as you were reading it, I was repeating it because these words are ingrained in my mind. Vivek speaks from a very specific personal experience here. He speaks from the fact that every perfume that he has made has been an homage to somebody, to some meeting, somebody or to somebody that he wants to meet in the future. So I'm thinking of the perfumes he created for his family in Lahore while he was in Grasse in France. I'm thinking of the perfumes that he made for the woman that he loved in France. I'm thinking of the perfumes that he made when he came back to Lahore, thinking back to the time that he met the woman that he loved in France. And now he's telling his nephew, who has very pointedly asked him, can perfumes be for a particular person? Can we recreate the smell of a person? And I don't want to go to like Patrick Suskind and perfume in this. This was actually one of my biggest fears, that the book would be too much like the already very famous book on perfume. But in fact, we do think this sometimes, that when we smell somebody or we spend time with somebody and they leave a very unique smell of theirs with us, either through, I don't know, a piece of clothing that we have of theirs or an object that used to belong to them, we always want to recreate the smell of that person. Or maybe the smells that they loved. Maybe they loved bourbon and oranges, or they had tobacco with, I don't know, ginger ale. I'm just mixing terrible smells, but we want to recreate that. And so very naively, Samir as a child asked his uncle, can I recreate the smell of a person? And he says, in fact, when you are making a perfume, you are always thinking about a person, because that is what gives you memory. That is what fuels that creation. And so he says that a perfume will always be created for people in general, like your audience, or a person specifically rooted through memory. And he also says this because he has lost the people that he's been creating perfumes for, Vivek, so it's a really important conversation and a slightly esoteric one for a child.
Yes, yes, it is. It is. It is. And that is what makes the entire narrative so fascinating. So, in the so many books on partition literature that you've read, which are the books that you've liked the most? Which are the authors that influenced you the most?
Well, I would say, when I was starting off writing on partition, the two people that I turned to that guided me were Ritu Menon and Urvashi Butalia. And I looked very much to Borders and Boundaries and The Other Side of
Stories of
Silence.
Okay,
Pardon me?
right. Mhm.
Yeah.
No, that Rishi Budalia's three-volume stories of partition, women stories on partition. That's the
Right.
book. Yes.
I'm talking about The Other Side of Silence, and then I'm talking about Borders and Boundaries. And I think it was very important to read those for me. They formed a lot of how I thought about partition. And the other book that I refer to quite a bit is actually Fikr Tosfi's Sixth River,
Yes,
Chhata
Sixth
Darya.
River. Sixth River was on our shortlist. The translation was on our shortlist. But the issue with shortlist and the final is that I mean, it's so difficult. I'm so happy I'm not on any jury because it's a juror's nightmare, to decide which is the best book. And books, it's so difficult. Even when you get the juror's assessment, the choosing from within the first five books is a real nightmare. And someday it's a good fiction it's a good fiction plot to set in. How do you choose the best book of the of five?
Maybe you write that book
It was
someday.
very good, very good. The Sixth River made a
Yeah.
lot of sense. It made a lot of
Yeah,
sense. Yes,
it was excellent. The translation by Maz bin Bilal is very good. And I think, when we are reading partition stories, we are reading them with distance. Even the writer has distance from what they are writing, because it's very rare that they are writing at the moment that it happened. And then you read Fikr Tosfi's journal that he keeps in Lahore for 4 months after partition, and you really have a sense that you're following him through those days you know so that is a book I recommend. And then Azadi Ki Chhaaw Mein,
Mhm.
Anis Kidwai, Begum Anis
Yes,
Kidwai,
that's
which is translated in English by Aisha Kidwai as In Freedom Shade. Another book I recommend, where Anis Kidwai is working in the refugee camps after partition, Humayun's tomb and Purana Killa camp, and she's writing about the things that she sees just after her husband has been killed during partition riots.
yeah. Okay. My favorite has been Yashpal.
Oh
Jhutha
yeah,
Sach.
yeah, Juta Sach, of
Uh,
course.
it's a very powerful.
That's a tome of partition. Actually, a great book to recreate Lahore as well.
Yes, yes. In fact, incidentally, a lot of wow books, a lot of wow prizes are around. I mean, by sheer coincidence. I mean, Manpreet Sodhi Someshwar's Lahore. I mean, she's now written a book on Lahore, but she got the wow prize for a book, the Radiance of a Thousand Suns. That's
Mm-hmm.
also post-partition Punjab. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
we have. What we'll do is, we have some questions, but I'll let those questions be answered by the on the email, because I would like to, continue our conversation. Two or three more aspects about your book, which I thought were very fascinating. Such a great deal of detail about France and about grass and about the perfume making industry over there. Because within Europe, it's only France which had this. And in fact, even you look at it, you don't imagine Germany to be a land of perfumes. I mean, Germany is a land of guns. It's a land of howitzers. It's a land of submarines and things. So France, somehow or the other, has always been there's something about the landscape of France which gives you the champagne, which gives you the perfume. So what's so special about France, and how did you create this France, which is so unique in its own way? Both Grasse and Paris, and the descriptions of Paris. It's absolutely wonderful.
Well, I spent a long time in France doing research for the book. I worked with perfumers both in France and in India, in Paris in France and Kannauj in India, to work on the specific vocabulary and understanding. I guess just the construction of a perfume, how it goes from the field to a bottle, what happens, and how different that is in the East and the West. That's also a big
Yes.
juxtaposition in the novel, that here we have a highly revered, almost bodily way of distilling perfume in India and Pakistan. And in the West, it does become a lot more mechanic, and then later really lab oriented, almost, with the clinical um, way in which now ingredients are composed without using actual ingredients themselves. So I think this was really important for me to see both worlds. And then I think the vocabulary of perfume is so specific that I had to work with someone who was embedded in the industry, because very early on itself you realize that there are certain terms that just don't belong in that space. Like, you don't have a recipe of a perfume, you have a composition for a perfume. And I wanted someone to read the book. I wanted, people who don't know enough about perfume, but also people that know a lot about perfume. I wanted them to read the book and say, oh God, this is exactly what it's like. Yes, this is what this thing smells like. This is what this ingredient makes me feel like. And then to celebrate the relationship between an a historic process, the body that has done it, the heart that is feeling the effect of that smell, and of course, the final fragrance itself. I did a lot of research on Grasse because, of course, that's the mecca of Western perfumery. It is also the place where Vivek flees to after he leaves the battlefield. And, there is an unfamiliarity. I was obviously feeling unfamiliar in France because it's not where I'm from, and so was Vivek. And that unfamiliarity was really important to bring in, because you're trying to make a place your own, which is not your own, through a really organic manner of flowers and leaves and sunshine and rain. And I think through him, I felt a little more comfortable there. And then through me, decades later, Samir, when he migrates to France, he feels a little more comfortable there, you know?
Yes, I think it is true. I mean, the younger Samir is far more comfortable. I mean, and that also shows about the way we have globalized. The way we've globalized. So the younger Samir has very little difficulties in finding the routes, in finding the maps. In fact, in connecting to Anouk, for example, it's a very easy relationship. They just get into a conversation or a cup of coffee so easily, which would not have been possible, 3 generations ago. Okay, now, because we are short on time, I would want you to read your favorite passages from the book, because we have 6 questions that are for you. But I'll send them to you on the email, and you can respond to us, and we'll put them on the website. But let's hear from you in your own voice, the best or the passages which you feel the most, for which you feel the most in this book.
Well, I haven't marked anything, so I'm. But do you have a favorite passage marked in your book? Perhaps I could read that.
No, no, okay, but then we can you can just you can read any page actually. Any
I
page
can
is
read one
all
page.
pages. I mean, every page is poetry. Every page is sheer poetry.
Okay. Okay. I will find something. Um,
So while you find something, I'll take this opportunity of thanking the National Digital Library of India, our
Absolutely.
partners in this great endeavor. And the NDLI has really reached out to through all its clubs. We reach out to 3,000 youth clubs in the country. I'd like to thank Green Panel, Coal India, ONGC, Ministry of Tourism, uh, Cello, REC, NEFED, Uttarakhand Tourism, and our technical partners, Technopack, for giving us this opportunity and giving us the space, especially to the REC, because REC is also funding the book awards this year and in the subsequent years. So by this time, I think, Anchal, you are ready to read.
I'm
Uh,
ready. I picked something from the beginning of the book, actually, just to tell you a little bit about the letters that soldiers wrote, because we spoke so much about that. By late autumn of 1914, when the colors of the fabric at their shops metamorphosed from light hues and pastels to shades of earth and shadow, Vivek's letters also grew darker. He had fought his first battle, and suddenly, like the war, his tone became distant, his letters detailing the cold weather and the unending wait. Waiting was the only constant, for there passed days without any activity. He wrote about waterlogged and marshy tunnels they would crouch in during battle, the sounds of bombs and fear of the enemy. He wrote of those who had died and many more who had been wounded. In rare moments of lightness, he mentioned his fellow sepoys and that he was learning to speak the Francisi language. As a literate sepoy, Vivek had been appointed as the company's scribe, a katib, and in addressing letters to homes and battalions deployed across the world, he had realized the sheer scale of this war. By winter, his letters became even more infrequent, and when he wrote in December 1914, he described how the entire battlefield had frozen under a thick bed of snow and the temperature had become unbearable. This morning, I found the ink in my inkpot to have frozen and had to melt the dark crystals over a fire so I may write this letter to you. All trace of green has vanished. Frost covers the earth as far as the eye can see. The clothes on our back are barely sufficient to protect us, and we have not seen the sun for months. Here, we are starved and sacrificed. These candid words left an unshakable sadness in Vij Bhavan, for before this they hadn't quite understood what war had meant, what it could mean. The thought of Vivek tombed under a blanket of snow began to haunt his family.
yes. Began to haunt the family, and most of our readers who are young listeners would not know that, at least I don't know whether Anchal has seen those times in the post offices. There would be people whose job was to read letters and write letters.
Yes,
So a lot of people, because most people did not know how to read, so they would, when the letter would come, either the postman would read out the letter to them, or when they would go to the post office, there would be these katibs who would be
yes,
sitting, who would open the letter, read out the letter to them, and also draft the letter back. So we live in an age of
yes,
Instagram, we live in an age of WhatsApp, and this book also connects us to an age where letter writing was a craft,
yes,
was and
yes.
and, and there was a mystique about the written word. Thank you very much, Anchal, for
Thank
a
you.
great book that you've written, for your conversation with us, and we hope that we'll continue we're looking forward. In fact, 3 questions are about when can we expect the sequel to the Book of
Oh,
Everlasting Memory. So here is it. More inspiration to you for
thank you.
writing what will
Thank you.
be a fantastic story of Samir and his friends. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.